اهلا بيكم جميعا. بقالنا كتير قوي ما عملناش حاجه جوه السنتر فمن وقت الكوفيد actually it's a pleasure to see all of you. Okay. It's a great evening and a great session and real honor. Yes, okay. Yes, I would like to welcome Dr. James Robinson, an university professor. He told me this is the most prestigious title, so I'll stick to that. There are so many others, okay, but I will talk about that in a minute. But I would also like to welcome Dr. Ahmed Galal, okay, professor and a great colleague, and His Excellency is the ex-Minister of Finance, the Egyptian government at a difficult phase of its life. Okay, so it's really a pleasure and an honor to have you as well. We're going to start the presentation, but let me first introduce Professor James. He is a prominent political scientist and economist. He has conducted influential research in the field of political and economic development and the factors that are the root causes of conflict. His work explores the underlying relationship between poverty and the institutions of a society and how institutions emerge out of political conflict. Drawing insights from game theory and global history, he employs rigorous statistical analysis and case studies to identify the political foundations of economic development and growth. He has a particular interest in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa. He is widely recognized for being the co-author of Why Nations Fail, The Origins of Power, Prosperity, and Poverty. That book is incredible, and the fact that it got translated to 32 languages is extremely impressive. 32 languages, so if you did not read it yet, make sure you do read it. Okay, currently is academic, including Arabic, by the way. Currently is an academic advisor to the World Bank, from 2017, working on the World Development Report on governance, and he has a really huge CV. It's a great honor and a pleasure to have you. So without any delay, we would like to start the presentation. Can we have the presentation on the screen, please? Yeah, you can, whatever you want.
I need a control.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, and thanks very much for inviting me. I'm going to talk. This is going to. Okay, brilliant. So I have a sort of generic title. I'm going to, most of my work has been about the relationship between political institutions and economic prosperity. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, about the relationship between political institutions and prosperity. And if you have political institutions that don't create prosperity, how could you think about getting political institutions that were more consistent with prosperity? And I'll let you decide whether that is or is not a issue in Egypt, since I'm not an expert on Egypt, as Dr. Abler was saying. Okay, so, and I'm going to start, with a little sort of theoretical discussion, just to sort of fix. I won't get too nerdy, but just to sort of fix ideas a little bit, just to sort of factually say, what we know about the world is, there's a very high association between measures of democracy and political freedoms, prosperity, and many aspects of the quality of life. Nothing is perfect, and there's no perfect society, certainly not the United States of America. So don't get me wrong about that. But there's sort of robust empirical evidence about the relationship between political institutions and these outcomes that we value: provision of public goods, prosperity, and political freedom. So here I put cause in black, because you could sort of say, well, all these things move together or they co-evolve. How do I know there's any sort of causal relationship between political institutions, particular types of democratic political institutions, and desirable social outcomes? Well, there is evidence that, these things cause desirable outcomes. Okay, of course, you might also just value the way decisions get made. You don't like democracy just because it generates good policy outcomes or prosperity. You also like that way of making decisions. So you may intrinsically value that way of making decisions, but let me focus mostly on the policy outcomes, okay? And I guess the interesting question for a social scientist like me is, when this looks like it's a good thing for society, why is it that so many people don't live in democratic political institutions? So if you look at the data, so this is a map from ourworldindata.org. If you know that website, it's a really fantastic website. They put together facts about all sorts of things. And here's a picture over the last 200 years, over 221 years, of the kind of evolution of democracy. And you can think of, they distinguish between different sorts of democratic regimes, but you can think of as being broadly democratic. They distinguish between democracies where you have, kind of liberal rights, if you like, and democracies which are a little bit sort of more dubious. And you can think of the red and orange as non-democracy. So you can see there's a big fall in democracy here, which is associated actually with the reclassification of India as being much less democratic than it used to be. And there's a lot of people in India. So, this is the number of people here. So this is not the number of countries, it's the number of people. So, but, until they reclassified India, you could sort of say around 50% of the people in the world were living in democratic countries. Obviously, this is heavily dominated by China and India, this picture here, But anyway, we all know what the facts is. So, I spent a lot of my career thinking about how to explain patterns of data like that, and how to develop kind of theoretical models, which economists love, to explain things like that, and doing empirical analysis of data sort of in the contemporary world and the historical world. And let me kind of, talk about theory for a little bit, because I think kind of understanding the theoretical approach that I'm proposing is important for understanding where I'm going to go, because it gives you a particular way of thinking about the problem in non-democratic countries and what you'd have to do to move forward. Okay, and you can, and I want to talk about the theory in particular because you can disagree with the assumptions. You can disagree with and say, no, I don't buy that. But what happens if people behave like this? And so I think it's important to understand what the incentives are and what the mechanisms are, and how, why people care about political institutions, and how democracy emerges out of non-democratic political institutions. So I'm an economist, by training. I usually describe myself as a recovering economist, actually. And that's funny if you know about alcoholics. But anyway, oh gosh, is that me doing that? No. Anyway, okay. So economists have this remorselessly rational view, of the world. They think of the world as being composed of instrumentally rational actors interacting, in particular context, the particular context being heavily shaped by institutions, political institutions. For example, I'm going to talk about President Biden and ex-President Trump in a minute, just so we're all on the same page, okay? But individuals have interests, they have preferences, and their ability to pursue their interest depends on their power, okay? And I'm going to talk about power in a very broad way. What does power mean? It might mean, Mao Zedong said, power comes from the barrel of a gun, So power might be weapons, it could be money, it could be ideas. Osama bin Laden had a lot of power because, he had a compelling set of ideas for some people, and he had an ideology which motivated many people to work with him. Okay, so that was ideology. Organization is power. And the ability to act collectively. I was just in Khartoum in the Sudan, and there's a lot of power on the street with these resistance committees, young, men and women who act collectively. That's power. But of course, power is shaped by institutions as well. So for example, why is Joseph Biden the president of the United States? Well, he won an election. The institutions said, here's a rule. If you get if you get this many votes in the Electoral College, you become president of the United States. And that gives you power. He gets the right to do all sorts of things because he's the president. Of course, the power is constrained by other institutions, the legislature, the independence of the Supreme Court, et cetera, administrative bodies. Okay, so there's I'm saying there's many sources of power, including institutions. Okay, but of course, the power allocated by institutions is contestable. It's contestable by other sources of power. President Trump, who according to the institutions lost the presidential election, tried to overthrow that by using power outside of the institutions. Okay, tried to override the institutions by trying to get around it, by trying to get people to disobey and ignore the institutions and try to storm, the Capitol. So that's an example of how institutions allocate power, but it's subject to other sorts of power. It's only one source of power. Okay, and then just to hear, when you don't like the equilibrium that institutions induce, you don't like the situation that institutions induce, then you may have the incentive to try to do something else, which is what President Trump tried to do. I think that would be pretty uncontentious, So there's a theory. I could spend a whole semester explaining that, but I did it in 5 minutes. So then, taking that as given, why would we explain why some countries are democratic and other countries are not, and recognizing that there's enormous differences between different sorts of democratic societies. There's enormous differences between different sorts of autocratic societies, let me say. I mean, that data I showed you tries to make some sorts of distinctions, but I don't want to get into that in a 25-minute talk. So let me just take those building blocks and sort of say, when would democracy emerge in a society? Well, different people have different interests, and different people have preferences, you could say, over different types of political institutions. Autocratic regimes work to the interests of some people. Okay, you could say the regime in China works to the interests of the people in the Communist Party primarily. Okay, so they have an interest in a particular set of political institutions. When would democracy emerge in a context like that? Well, when power is redistributed. Okay, so if I carry on with the example of China, where I have here Britain in 1832. 1832 was the first Reform Act in Britain. It was the kind of start of modern democracy. Prior to that, Britain sort of had elections, but it was a very, very narrow franchise. Less than 5% of people actually voted in those elections. Okay, so 1832 led to this big increase in suffrage. So prior to 1832, the political system, you could say, it was an autocracy, but it suited the interests of people who had political power. Okay, so how would a situation like that ever turn into a democracy? Well, we can think of several reasons. One, of course, is that preferences of autocrats change. The world changes, society changes. Could be your preferences change too, and you decide you'd actually be better off in a democracy. Okay, could happen. Probably more important empirically is that there's a change in power relations in society, and I think this is the right story about 1832 in Britain, that those who are disadvantaged by the system, who prefer a more open political system, get more power, and they force democracy to be created. Okay, so you can think of other examples. In Argentina in 1983, the military government collapsed, because they lost a war. That's actually a big source of political transitions, losing wars. But so just for a moment, I want you to think about these power relations and how different groups of people in society typically have different interests and different sets of political institutions. They allocate power differently and they serve different interests. Okay, so then if that's your perspective on the world, very rational kind of materialistic idea, then transitions come from changes in power relations, I would say. Okay, so then you want to think this framework leads you to think about factors that influence these. My discussion of power is very abstract, and preferences are very abstract. Like, why do people care about one sort of set of institutions rather than another? Maybe the Chinese Communist Party, that's a pretty clear instance. They think, well, we could have a democracy, then we'd have to compete for support in the election. Yeah, we might not be so popular, so let's just leave things as they are. Okay, just to give you one example, which will come up later in some of my other examples, one of the most famous books about the conditions that lead to different preferences over political institutions would be, Barrington Moore's social origins of dictatorship and democracy. And he sort of said, well, there are some key social prerequisites for having a democratic society. One is the absence of labor oppressive agriculture. If you have a lot of labor, you need to repress labor, slavery, serfdom. You need to control the state to control the people. Okay, so that's not consistent with a democratic society typically. And he also talked about a sufficiently large bourgeoisie. That's not a word that gets used very much at the University of Chicago. A sufficiently large bourgeoisie, who prefer democratic institutions. Okay, I'm not going to talk about, there's lots of other ideas, modernization, civil society. I'll just give you one cute example, about this kind of logic in action, which comes from, when the Derg was overthrown in Ethiopia, by the Tigrayans in 1992, 1993. US government, in its wisdom, sent, my former colleague, Sam Huntington, off to decide whether Ethiopia should be a democracy or not, And this is the report he wrote, and I'll just show you a little bit about what are the prospects for democracy in Ethiopia. There's different options, Western style, two or multi-party democratic system, some form of non-democratic system, which could be one-party system, military rule, personal dictatorship, etc. The first is probable, but undesirable, he did say, and he sort of says, the third possible, no, here we go. A constitutional system has to reflect the nature of society. Okay, so that's a sort of Barrington Moore idea. So Sam Huntington went to Ethiopia. He said Ethiopia was poor with no history of democracy and no civil society. It's going to be a dictatorship. That might be bad, but that's what they're stuck with. So here's that thinking in mind. Okay, so let me sort of emphasize here something which kind of came up, but let me just because it's important in the discussion, which is institutions in power. I gave the example of President Biden. President Biden, the institutions have allocated power to President Biden. But within limits. Okay, within limits. Democracy creates power. By altering who makes decisions and how decisions are made. But just as in the example of President Trump, that power is subject to contestation outside of the institutions, And one of the problems with democracy, one of the problems with the consolidation of democracy is what you see, historically, is that in many instances, democracy is created by a change in power relations, but that power is transitory. In particular, it's often created by, collective action, which is what's happening in Khartoum and the Sudan recently, but it's very difficult to sustain collective action. Okay, that's what we know. All right. So that power is transitory. And if it's transitory, then it's difficult to sustain. It's difficult to sustain and it's easier to reverse. Okay, so this is one of the fundamental problems about sustaining democratic transitions or consolidating democracy. Okay, so what I want to say, back up a little bit and sort of say, most economists don't care about politics and political institutions. They just care about policy, So could it be, that, you could just promote good policy? Why in this business of political institutions and things like that? Wouldn't anyone want to promote policies that are good for social welfare? If you've read Thomas Hobbes's famous book, Leviathan, Hobbes sort of proposed this all-powerful, dictator to bring order to society. And at some point, 400 pages into the book, he sort of asks himself, well, isn't Leviathan going to really act in people's collective interests? And he thought, yeah, of course it will. So we don't need to worry about that. Okay. So, but I think the evidence suggests no. That actually, good public policy does depend on political institutions because, for example, I think typically, in my experience, autocratics, I'm going to give you a not completely autocratic example, but autocratic regimes, they don't have the interest, they're not accountable, they don't have the interest to work they don't have the incentives to work in the collective interest. Okay, so and here's my example, which is a Colombian example for the Colombians in the room. My favorite one is, what happens this is an imperfect democracy, should I say. Colombia is a democracy, but it's a highly imperfect democracy. What happens there's underinvestment in public goods. There's underinvestment in the health system. What happens when there's a pandemic? There's a problem. You have undersupply of public goods. It's not really a problem if you can buy an air ticket and go to, where is it, Miami, and get yourself vaccinated. So here's some Colombians going to Miami. It happened to everywhere in Latin America. Did it happen in Egypt? I don't know. Yeah, probably. Yes, I bet. Yes. Okay. So you know, elites, you don't have the incentive to provide public good. You can self-provide many things. Security. You can go to the US, to get vaccinated. You can self-provide education, private schools. So you don't really need to act in the collective interest because you can solve many of the problems yourself. All right. So, okay. So here's the picture. That's just to say, I don't think it's the case that you can think of good policy independently of the political institutional environment. Okay, so good policy is really conditional on having political institutions that promote accountability, that promote responsiveness of the state to society's interests. And I would think typically you get public good provision through the benevolence of an elite. Okay, so that means if you're thinking about reform, when you're thinking about policy, it's a bit simplistic to think about policy independent of political institutions. That in fact, you ought to be thinking about reform not as, there's this market failure, we want to solve that problem, we want to solve this problem, because remember, we're remorselessly rational people here, So rational politicians understand the environment, So if a policy was good in their interests, they'd be doing it already. You can contest that, but that's the methodology. Okay, so if I keep that very hyper rational method going, that sort of says, well, actually, people in an autocratic regime, they may be under-providing public goods. There may not be economic growth, but they're acting in their interests. So telling them there's a different policy which is better is a waste of time in this world. Okay, so policy is not really about addressing, not just about addressing problems of social welfare in a classic kind of public finance type of way. It's also about thinking of how you change the equilibrium, or how do you change the political equilibrium? Because ultimately, that's what will give you policy which is better for the collective interest. Okay, and I'm going to say that sounds challenging. Okay, because that sounds challenging, and then I just said, well, if I tell the Chinese government, you should be doing this policy, and they know about it, but they don't adopt it because it's not in their interests, then how could you possibly change the equilibrium, change the political equilibrium? And I guess my point is that if you start thinking about this, and I'm going to give you three. I'm already conscious I'm talking too much, but I'm going to give you three kind of examples which I think are very powerful. But, go back to my discussion of the 1832 Reform Act. How did the 1832 Reform Act come about? Well, in some sense, that was a consequence of all the social change that came with the Industrial Revolution. My favorite English newspaper, which I've read, since I was a kid, is the Manchester Guardian. Okay, what did the Manchester Guardian, whoever thought of starting a newspaper in that god-awful place? Well, because that's where the Industrial Revolution was. And in fact, the Manchester Guardian was started right after the Peterloo riot, which was a pro-democracy riot. If you go to Manchester now, they have a big museum, and it's not so bad, actually, Manchester. I take that all back. Anyway, so 1832 is a consequence of urbanization, of the development of what would Barrington Moore say, a proletariat. Of all of this kind of tectonic social change, which came with the Industrial Revolution, which British political elites couldn't think through at all. Okay, so I think I want to sort of put that idea out there. That this all sounds terribly complicated, but once you start thinking about it, I think there's the world is full of all these tectonic changes that have huge impacts on kind of society and people's interests and people's power, I want to say, but which are very difficult to kind of think through. All right, so okay, let me give you some examples. Okay, I'm going to give you three examples of what I call changing the equilibrium. And I'm sort of saying, maybe this is the way we should be thinking about policy. Okay, so the first one is the mechanization of cotton picking in the US South in the 1950s and 1960s. The second one is going to be, which had a terrific impact. And most scholars would say, I'm not a scholar of any of these three examples. I'm using other people's work. The second one is a work of one of my PhD students, but the first one has been studied by many economic historians. I'll get into that in detail. So mechanization of cotton picking and the development of the civil rights movement, the spread of green revolution technology in the 1960s and 1970s, and the collapse of the Congress Party in India, that may be relevant, more relevant in Egypt, since this is a hydraulic society. I was reminded this week. It's a hydraulic society. Yeah, so I love that correction. So I'm going to show you some data on irrigation, and here's one that my wife complained about. But so I had to put some extra bullet points on. You'll see where she complained. But the spread of home utility in the 20th century and the empowerment of women. So there's some extremely interesting evidence that the spread of electricity and washing machines, dishwashing machines, vastly reduced the amount of time that women had to spend in the home, and is associated with large increases in female labor force participation, to which my wife said, well, and doing the washing, that's not work, this is just some screwed up, pardon my French, set of social norms. Like to say that this is empowering women is just demeaning all the work they were doing to start with. So let me, you'll see what I mean. Okay, so I'll just show you a little bit of data here, and then I'll shut up. I'm sure you've got the idea. Okay, so you're probably not interested in what mechanical cotton pickers look like. But here's the data, which is in 1949, basically no cotton was picked by machines in the US South. So who picked the cotton? Tens of thousands of Black people, African Americans, who are basically repressed in order to keep a low-wage client labor force in place. Mechanization of cotton pick, this is like the US total, but here's Mississippi, Texas, Louisiana. You can see that it rockets up in the 1950s. Okay, so when cotton was mechanized, suddenly you didn't need to repress and control all these people to pick the cotton and keep wages low. And what else? Remember Barrington Law. If you have to repress labor, this is a great example of labor repressive agriculture. If you have to repress labor, you need to control state institutions, because it's the state that controls people. These people are controlled by all sorts of Jim Crow legislation, if you know that expression. So then, you don't need to spend resources on controlling all these people. Who cares? We don't need them anymore. We've got tractors. We've got tractors. You see, tractors. So what happens after this? Well, here's civil rights. If you look at data, this is from a famous Stanford sociologist, Douglas McAdam, on campaigns, freedom rides, sit-ins, bus boycotts. As the people are freed from all this control, there's a big upsurge in collective action by people in the South. And that's what happens, politically. So in 1940 or 1950, this is Mississippi at the bottom. Mississippi is the worst, right? Yeah, so here's Mississippi around. Basically, Black people are completely disenfranchised. It goes through the roof, starting in the 1960s, and by the end of the 1960s, I guess going in reverse now, but Black people are empowered. So they protested. They got the federal state to dismantle, many of the things which kept them politically marginalized. All right. So here's an example of, it's just a cotton picker, like what's this, a tractor? What's the big deal? But it had tectonic social, there's other stuff going on. It's social science. There's always lots of stuff going on. So it played a very important role in this transition, this political transition. Okay. So what about the Green Revolution? The Green Revolution, high-yielding rice, wheat, different crop varieties, disseminated in India starting in the late 1960s, massively increased agricultural productivity. The way the Congress Party was organized rurally in many parts of the country was they bought votes through landowners. Landowners had big social networks of tenants who they lent money to and basically controlled. The Green Revolution enormously increased productivity. Suddenly you weren't dependent on big landowners to get loans anymore. You were freer economically and you were freer politically. So landowners lost control over the rural tenants. Okay, what happened to the Congress Party vote share? Well, this is a measure. The darker it is, the more intense are these high-yielding crop varieties. Okay, so the bigger the increase in the use of these Green Revolution technologies, the darker here, the bigger the fall in the Congress Party vote share. So without going into the data in great detail, you can do the kind of there's a very strong correlation between the spread of Green Revolution technology and the collapse of the Congress Party. Congress Party just lost control of its rural electorate in some sense. And here's the pictures and here's the data on aquifers. You could sort of say, well, one thing that massively encouraged the spread of these Green Revolution technologies is irrigation. So you need a lot of water for these technologies. So what you see, actually, this is just the percentage of aquifer coverage, that the more irrigation, the larger the fall of the Congress Party vote share, and that's coming through the greater ability to use these high-yielding seed varieties. Okay, so that's my homage to the Oriental despotism thesis. Okay, so actually, it's the wrong way around, though, isn't it? Anyway. So let's the next example I'm going to show up, which is just female, employment. This is the example my wife didn't like, but but here's the spread in the United States of water. Gosh, flush toilet, central heating, electricity. So in 1900, this sort of goes from nothing to close to 100% covering. And here's the spread of all these household appliances: refrigerator, dishwasher, dryer. I mean, the dishwasher, the 40%. But if you ever look up and Google what a dishwasher looks like, a washing machine. So what a washing machine looks like in 1920, it's just the craziest thing. Microwave. I'm not going to. So you need electricity for these things. So there's this huge expansion in these domestic appliances. It's just a washing machine. What's the big deal? Okay. Well, what you see if you look at the hours per week, the hours per week that women work is, again, so this is the picture my wife didn't like. So that doing the housework to start with. That's the real problem. So it's conditional on some stereotypes, some social. That's her problem with it. But here's the thing. Traditionally, on this sexist model of US society, women's homework basically falls by 2/3, okay? And at the same time, there's a rapid expansion, there's a 1,000% increase over that period of female labor force participation. So I think, again, this is a completely unintended consequence of technological advance and, these machines which freed women, to do many other things. And to which my wife said, yeah, they were working at the home, but now they're working outside the home. Big deal. But it turns out that, working outside the home, maybe has consequences for society that working at home doesn't have. That was my defense. Okay, so that's let me just point out one thing, and then I'll close with my slide. But Ahmed said he liked my last slide, so I don't let me jump that. Just to say, what's going on here, kind of backing up to my original motivation, is everyone's making rational decisions. Like cotton plants has found it profitable to buy. They're in this equilibrium of like apartheid, of repressing black people. I can make money by buying a tractor. And landowners, we can make higher profits. These tenants, they're going to make more money with these high-yielding crop varieties. Or like the household income from sending from their wife going out to work. Okay, so here, individuals making rational decisions, millions of individuals making rational decisions, basically leads the whole equilibrium to unravel. That's the point. Okay. Now, of course, you could say, well, somebody could be internalizing that. Somebody could be internalizing the consequence of all these decisions on the equilibrium. But nobody got it. Nobody understood it. Even white political elites in the US South in the 1950s didn't understand that mechanization of cotton picking was going to lead to this dramatic change in power relations. And, men didn't understand what the consequence of the washing machine was, and the Communist Party didn't understand what the consequence was going to be of the Green Revolution technologies. Okay, so one thing about this, I'm sort of painting this contest over political regimes as somehow being, very zero sum. I like one system and you like a different system, and we just duke it out, as they say in the United States. But one thing which is fascinating about the US South is what happened after this Southern equilibrium collapses in the 1950s and 1960s. Was it true that black people were better off and white people were worse off? The fact of the matter was, everybody was better off. So Galen Wright, who's a very distinguished economic historian at Stanford, has a fabulous book about this, if you're interested, called Sharing the Prize. Sharing the Prize. Very significant title. I'll jump to the kind of, the bottom line here, which is this slide, which is, black wages increased dramatically in the 1960s. But funnily enough, so did white wages. Okay, so just to say, this was a very, very inefficient equilibrium from a social perspective. Okay, so I think Gavin Wright has a very nice discussion of this, which is, the superstructure of segregation had a life of its own, embedded in norms, perceptions, interests, and institutions of remarkable persistence and resilience. I think that human beings have a great ability, to kind of rationalize what they're doing. Daniel Kahneman, if you've read his book about social psychology, he has this terminology, system number one and system number. There's two parts of the brain, the system number one and system number two. And system number one is just the kind of unconscious, you make decisions, you don't think about them. It's just, you do things. And then sometimes things go wrong, and then you engage system number two. And system number two is like the rational, intelligent, calculating part of your brain. But the first impulse is always to rationalize what you're doing as being the sensible thing to do. So I think I'm emphasizing hyper-rationality, so this is a bit inconsistent. But his point is, this system in the South got set up in the 19th century. People had all sorts of justifications for it. President Eisenhower, famously said, in the 1950s, when contestation started over the legal system in the South, Eisenhower said, laws don't change, the heart of man. To which Martin Luther King said, laws may not change the heart of men, but they may stop someone lynching me, and that's a good thing. So this was a historic equilibrium, and the world changed, but it still took something to shock it out, and that's what, there were many things, but that's what. Okay, so my last slide. Just to say, what I'm saying here is, what we really need to think about is how to change equilibrium. Equilibrium do change. I gave you some examples of massive change. The world is much more democratic than it was. We could talk about lots of examples, but you have to fight with many interests in non-democratic systems. And what I'm suggesting is that when we're thinking about this is just to focus on these unintended consequences, of which I think there are many. I just gave 3 examples, and maybe one kind of algorithm is just to think of, how do you make the unintended intended? Was that the bit you liked? He's leaving now.
Was that actually was that?
I'm done. Yeah, I was speeding up. I felt like I was talking too much. Yeah. Oh, okay. All right. So I'll play for time. I could tell some jokes. I'm not very good at jokes, actually. Yeah. So I think I think I made the point. That many countries where I work, like I've worked for 12 years now in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The Democratic Republic of Congo, there's not much democracy. The current president basically came to power through a completely faked election, and there's very little developmental impulse in Congo. So you could propose, all sorts of policies, which don't get implemented, or you could try to think about, the real problem is the equilibrium. How could we intervene in ways which could perturb that equilibrium or push Congo to a different sort of equilibrium? And I'm not proposing here, notice I'm not proposing revolution, Theda Skocpol, one of my ex-colleagues, at Harvard, Theda Skocpol, Theda wrote her dissertation in the 1970s about revolution. She wrote a very famous book about social revolutions, published in 1979. And the main conclusion is, looking historically at social revolutions, is the main impact, the main consequence of social revolutions is to create a more powerful, centralized state. So that's not what I'm saying here. I'm saying this is a much more gradualist approach, and I think that's a much more, what the evidence suggests is that's probably a much more likely approach to be fruitful and to create different societies. That creates, of course, there was conflict in the US South in the 1950s. So nothing is completely perfect, but I didn't make that point clear, but now I did. All right, so let me sit down.